You're listening to episode 28 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Dr. Cliff Saron speaks with us about the limits of science, our paradigms, and the relation between statements made at the population level and what is meaningful for the individual in Buddhist training. Our meditation is, by its very nature, in our own body and mind. It's internal. There's very little for someone to watch on the outside. They can't do a fly-through of our minds to see what's going on. As it is so very subjective, there's a challenge when science does a study about that practice. We can ask participants in a study about various aspects of their daily activities, and how these may have changed while meditation was being done, and from that draw some numerical models of what kinds of effects people may see. But we can't tell the individual meditator, here's exactly what's going to happen to you every time. Today we speak with Dr. Cliff Saron about the implications of studying a subjective internal experience with objective external information. What can science tell us, and what may be some of the limitations we can expect? Cliff Saron is a PhD at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, currently an associate research scientist at the Center for Mind and Brain at UC Davis. His work centers on two broad areas. The first is focused on the training of attention and emotion regulation through contemplative practice. That main project here is known as the Shamatha Project, a large-scale collaborative and multi-method longitudinal study of the effects of intensive meditation training. His second research area concerns sensory processing, multisensory integration, and interhemispheric communication in children with autism spectrum disorders. So sit back, relax, and have a nice single malt. If you have to ask that that's chocolate or vanilla, we're thinking about different things. And I'm speaking with Dr. Cliff Saron. Cliff, thanks so much for being here.
It's a pleasure, Ted.
So we've been chatting about a few questions we wanted to talk with you about, and I thought we'd start with having you tell us a little bit about your background as a scientist, atheist, and meditator, and if those worlds collided, or was it a smooth merging?
What a great question.
I spent time working on that one.
I'm somewhat of a child of the 60s, and a lot about altering consciousness and states of consciousness was present in my high school experience. I had a very broad-minded father who actually took some field trips to Millbrook when Richard Alpert and Tim Leary were in residence. And he observed, but he did not partake. He brought back mandalas that I put on my high school door in my room. And I began thinking about what are the possibilities in life through attending humanistic psychology meetings and listening to Indian music, and it was all a very stereotypical, almost hackneyed kind of childhood at that time, save for one thing. I was very asthmatic, and I dare not smoke very much marijuana or experiment too much with drugs. So I was very interested in variations of one state through just introspective means and different exercises that were related to meditation. And very influential was, I think for many people, Ram Dass at that time. I wound up at the first summer session of Neuro, and Ram Dass was teaching the first course since he'd been removed from Harvard. And he had a section person, Joseph Goldstein, who was teaching a meditation class. And no one knew Joseph at that time. And he walked into this class, and it was late in the afternoon, and he said, "You know, when the sun goes down, there arises in the mind the intention to turn on the light." And that phrase, that was 1974. It's 36 years ago. And something for me clicked, because I was very interested in science. I was interested in physical process, and I was interested in the emergence of consciousness from biological matter. And that process view implied by those words very deeply connected. So I found him very clear and began to do some sitting at the early days of the Insight Meditation Society. And one summer, I think after probably 6 or 7 10-day retreats, it was July. I was sitting by a window in the Berkshires listening to bees and plants. And I remembered that I'd been a very sick middle school camper in the Berkshires, in infirmaries, sitting in July, listening to bees at a window. And that connected with that as someone who'd nearly died multiple times from severe asthma, the simple delight of being able to watch my breath work filled me with joy as a child. And here I was paying for the privilege in a retreat context. So to me, my sense of introspection and its priority in my life really was rooted in a kind of survival process, being very sick, that began way before I really understood anything about Buddhist teachings or much about science. So that was a kind of substrate. Because I grew up being interested in science and technology, it was natural to major in science, and I did in biology. And at Harvard in the early 70s, I got connected to a wonderful group, community, that consisted of folks like Richie Davidson, who's still a dear friend and colleague, and Danny Goleman and David McClelland, and, who at once had terminated Leary and Alpert as teachers at Harvard, and then became students of Neem Karoli Baba with his wife. So there was a community of sitting practice. Mark Epstein was around at that time, others who were involved in really creating institutions. And in the course of this, in about 1975, I met Francisco Varela at Lindisfarne, and I was reading his work with Maturana. And there was a feeling that there was a natural synthesis between scientific inquiry, contemplative practice, and what there is to do given one's embodiment during the time one has. And that gave rise to a long working partnership with Richie Davidson in his laboratory, and a friendship with Joseph Goldstein, Jack Kornfeld, Sharon Salzberg, and other teachers. And there was always an idea to do research related to what might be going on when someone meditates. And when I went to graduate school in the late 1980s, in 1990, I had the opportunity to go to Dharamsala to fill in for Richie at a meeting with the Dalai Lama at a Mind and Life conference, the third one. And I met some extraordinary folks there. And Alan Wallace was translator for that meeting. I was rooming with Francisco Varela. John Kabat-Zinn was there, among others. And the idea to try to bring the emerging tools of cognitive neuroscience to a kind of project, in a field project. Alan had been a monk for 14 years up on Bagsu Mountain in Dharamsala, elsewhere, and he had connections, so to speak. So we actually thought we might do a project, which we did, funded by the Fetzer Institute. And it was an extraordinary adventure, but the cross-cultural issues, combined with questions of whether or not you meet an extraordinary person, you don't know how they were before they encountered or practiced the teachings.
Right, you don't have a baseline. Right?
There's no adequate baseline. So we decided that there had to be some kind of longitudinal project, and it would be much more feasible, scientifically tractable, methodologically more rigorous if we conducted it in the West. And that was actually the priority and the basis that formed the ground for the Shamatha project, which Alan Wallace suggested we mount. One side was situated at UC Davis after my degree in opportunity in a new center called the Center for Mind and Brain, which seemed an apt place to launch such an endeavor. So the atheist part,
another world.
The atheist part, I think I always felt that the quality of open-heartedness that one can feel in life, and the grace and gratitude that one can feel very easily can be misattributed outside oneself and outside this ordinary life. So I honored those feelings in myself, but it felt like there was a frame big enough and deep enough in the secular worldview to hold the full expanse of human experience. And this was easy to come by for me because my first religious training was in ethical culture, which is a humanist, secular humanist organization. So I felt like religious experience was a certain quality of emotional experience with elements of attribution within a particular domain, belief domain. And I could love the experience, and I did not feel drawn to a theistic or interpretation, or as I learned about Buddhism, I deeply appreciated the huge worldview. For me, the first time I met Kalu Rinpoche, he talked to a group of 20-somethings about the privilege of taking incarnation as a human. No one really talks like that, and I thought that that's an incredible way to approach each other. And you could do that without the cosmology. You could do that by intent. You can do that with your children. My God, what an opportunity, no pun intended. So it was a move from, I think, agnosticism to not being able to get away from the idea that humans create the explanatory systems in which they invest themselves, whether it be science or any spiritual or religious framework. And I can't get away from that conclusion. So that's the support for atheism.
It seems that to many of us who share that kind of experience, that we don't have any real conflict, that they blend quite nicely and seamlessly and effortlessly as we learn and practice. And it sounds like that was the experience you had as well.
Yes.
We chatted a little bit about getting overly committed to the evidence-based way. And we see some folks in our atheist community rejecting experience completely rather than taking it into context. Can you tell us a little bit more about that idea of not being overly committed to the evidence-based way?
Sure. I think that there are different ways to approach this question. I think it's very important not to elevate the methods of science to trump human experience. And rather, science needs to incorporate in a very sophisticated and nuanced way what real experience feels like as reported by individuals that we study. So one of the goals of the view of a best practice way to think about investigating the effects of contemplative practice is to use sophisticated first person and third person methods and see how they interrelate. And people's experience is extraordinarily important, and scientific published results rely on statistical findings, which we cannot directly apply to individuals outside the data set that was examined, nor does every single person in a study that shows highly significant effects experience the same degree of change or quality that's being investigated. So one of the commitments of researchers, I think today, particularly inspired by the work of the Mind and Life Institute. Disclosure, I'm affiliated with the Mind and Life Institute.
Full disclosure, appreciated. Yep.
is a real commitment to integration of nuanced first and third person approaches, and also second person perspectives. That is to say, what is, you go to a retreat, you don't ask the retreatant what changed. You ask their wife, their son, their daughter, their teacher. And then we carry this out in time. I think one of the problems is that when things are published in science, the public doesn't appreciate the provisional nature. These are very early days in a process that's going to take decades, because the methodological issues involved in looking at the effects of meditation in particular are pretty large. For instance, we rarely have studies that can fully separate the worldview someone has from the practice they do. Within the practice they do, we don't yet fully have methods to understand exactly what people are doing when they meditate. We know what the instructions are, but, there is a level at which you wouldn't investigate musical training without being able to hear a performance. And what the scientific response to that is basically to look at what are the trait changes, what are things you can measure before and after an intervention that reflects something that is learned by doing the practice, or whatever the intervention is. But you can't necessarily know mechanistically for a given individual what about what they were doing caused the effect.
Well, it's the example that I use sometimes is we can have all the studies we want about what chocolate or maple flavoring or whatever tastes like, but you actually need to have some to find out what it tastes like. A study isn't going to tell you that.
Well, there's another aspect to this and that is, what are the hopes or negative biases that scientific findings might do to motivate or demotivate you from meditating or any practice. If someone said, you do an active control condition and maybe you're gardening or you're exercising, and yet you have an interest in exploring introspectively your mind in a stiller, more quiet venue. You see, well, there are benefits of gardening, or there are benefits of any variety of endeavors that might even for some things be greater. Exercise certainly is going to make you more physically fit than sitting, at least burn more calories. Maybe there are folks who would counter that many things are possible in sitting practice, and I'm very naive with respect to what's possible. But you wouldn't want your personal interest to be fully trumped by the state of the data. So there's got to be a middle path, common sense. Obviously, if you don't like exercising and you just think that you will be the exception to the rule of the couch potato, that's not the middle path. That doesn't include lots of really good evidence that you need to move your body for longevity and health and well-being. And there's an awful lot of data from many different sides that there are benefits with some type of slowing down practice. But this all has to be considered into what one's independent commitment to the quality of their life is. And I don't think that there is any paper or study that is, the unique one that applies to any single given individual.
This ties in very nicely with the question we had chatted about a little bit before about a relation between statements made at the population level and what's meaningful to the individual. And it sounds like this is part of a description of that, is that we can have numerical evidence of the benefits of meditation, but really it's a personal experience.
Yes, and there may be kinds of practices and kinds of activities where if you do the instructed practice, there will be a very, very high probability that you will get a particular result. That might apply to something like weight training. And we have no equivalent ability to peer inside one's mind and see that they did the right number of reps in the right trajectory with the right speed.
Right.
So we can't just make a wholesale equivalence between things. So on the other hand, people have very strong commitments in their lives to things that are clearly maladaptive. So I'm not really saying that you shouldn't take evidence into account. And I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying that the evidence in the literature is presented on a statistical basis where the variability of the population tested is actually disclosed. But anything short of the actual published work does not represent that.
So what do you see as the goals of this practice, and do you have any comments about the different ways to achieve those goals?
Well, I think, Ted, there are many different goals that individuals have for approaching contemplative practice. In our project, I think there's a broad spectrum of goals, and that's actually something that we're investigating because we specifically asked people about their goals, and we conducted structured interviews which we're analyzing, and we'll have something to say about the spectrum of goals within the limited population of individuals that we studied. For myself, my goal when I meditate is simply to return to a sense of deeply appreciating my life and the matrix in which I'm embedded. My feeling tone is simply to give space and to be restorative with the conditions of my life. I don't have a very formal sense of specific aspiration. I think this is a very interesting and deep question because embedded in one's goals is a whole sense of their history, their background, their training, their motivation, their skill, and their experience to date. So it really is something that importantly deserves qualitative and quantitative investigation. And then we can see how goals actually interrelate with trait changes from practice. To get at this question of practice, one thing that is often not on the table is that science is a deep path, at least as experienced from myself and my colleagues involved in this work and in their life in science. It's not really like taking a work of art and trying to put it into some kind of testing laboratory that's going to piece apart the active ingredients. It's much closer to crafting that work of art itself. So it's provisional and it's deeply felt, and the effort required to do it is not often visible outside the career.
Well, and indeed, in individual sittings, you can have a great deal going on inside the individual who's on the cushion, but really they look just like the person next to them who may not have any activity going on. They may just be focused on the breath and with energy and attention, and that's it.
Well, we would say that would have a whole lot going on.
Because of the energy. That's why I qualified it with energy.
If you could take a fly through them, you would find, just an extraordinary amount. Practice is a word that, I feel utterly unqualified to speak about a Buddhist point of view. I feel touched deeply by this tradition, but unable to professionally represent it. So I can tell you that we were studying specific practices that Alan Wallace taught in our research. And we, in work at Spirit Rock, look at Vipassana practices. But because we cannot know the quality of mind moment by moment in individuals that we study, and we know that the goals are to make the distinction between formal sitting practice and life off the cushion seamless. By extension, life on the cushion is life off the cushion.
Yeah, there's no separating it.
There's no particular separating it, and there are clearly psychological qualities that shift. Just like I'm talking to you and I won't be, and I'll be checking my email, and there's shifts.
Let me try another avenue to explore. You'd mentioned that there were studies that you participated in and done based on work that was being done at Spirit Rock and with Alan Wallace. Were there particular conclusions that came out of those studies?
Well, the largest study that I'm part of is the Shamana Project, where I'm the principal investigator working with a collaborative, extraordinary group of almost 30 scientists, faculty members at UC Davis, postdoctoral fellows, scientists at other institutions. And it's kind of a village project. We've published our first paper, and you've interviewed Catherine McLean about the findings of change in visual perception and sustained attention. We have additional work coming out that's in press in the journal Emotion, headed up by Baljinder Sadra and Catherine and other colleagues, that look at the relationship between improvements in inhibiting habitual responses and adaptive psychological function. And we have other very interesting work that's currently under review that relates to biochemical changes related to cellular aging, and that I'll be in more of a position to talk about once that's been accepted for publication. We have tentative initial results that are suggestive of improved working memory in 1 month Vipassana retreat, but we haven't run control subjects in that task yet. And that's work spearheaded by Tony Zanesco and Brandon King, graduate students in my laboratory. There's an emerging picture of many domains of change, and the largest summary statement is that things change in good directions. And that's statements at the population level. That doesn't mean that everyone changed or that everyone in intensive training situations has a good final outcome. I think it's really important to consider how much training is necessary, what is trying too hard, what is over practice, what is taking too literally some of the aspirations that are involved in the practice, and what are essentially the cognitive dissonant elements to engage in training with a teacher with a traditional Buddhist worldview, and then coming back to the secular Western society in America or elsewhere. Regarding our work with emotion, spearheaded by Erica Rosenberg, Tony Zanesco, and Brandon King, I think what we're finding is a broad range of, at the population level, enhancements in well-being and adaptive psychological function and perception and attention and executive control, and emotional fluency that may be related to a diminution of aversion. But those statements are subject to yet critical analysis.
One of the topics that I know I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on is one you'd suggested in our email conversations before the interview, and it's something you had mentioned you wanted to discuss. So I want you to go to town and describe for us the Tuchus effect.
This is a term that I cooked up sitting on the lawn at a Mind and Life Summer Institute with Paul Grossman, who's a psychophysiologist in Basel. The Tuchus effect is, Tuchus is Yiddish for your butt. And from the neuroscientific perspective, when you do something repeatedly, you are changing your brain. If you repeatedly sit on a cushion and stay immobile, there are many things that change in the representation of your body to itself in your brain, because you're not refreshing as broadly the movements of the body in the world, and you've changed your sensory input because typically your eyes are hooded or closed, and you've changed visual input, and we know from some extraordinary studies by Magankar Sur's laboratory at MIT and others that even over the course of several hours, tiny microscopic dendritic spines of your visual cortex neurons actually grow and retract as a function of the visual milieu you have. There's a very rich literature of the role of changes to sensory input change brain functioning. There's a study by Alvaro Pascual Leon and colleagues that shows if you blindfold yourself during a long leisurely meal, your hearing will be changed, within 3 hours of doing that. There's the question, independent of what you might be doing with your attention, just taking the posture and changing your behavior by not doing what you might have been doing, whether it's watching TV or shopping or talking on the phone, so whether you're going out for a walk even, there's an abject behavioral change by implementing the practice, formally in sitting or walking slowly or lying down and paying attention. So the Tuchus effect is all of the possible changes due to the physical behavioral constraints of undertaking a formal practice, separate from the meditation instructions, other than assuming the practice.
And to me, it's fascinating that we have actual studies that show that a particular practice that one has, whether it's meditation or whatever it is, can impact the brain in this way and the body in this way that shows that we're not just gaining practice in a different mindset, that there are physiological changes occurring.
Yeah, but we're all neuroplastically reorganized by our computer skills. Don't know how much of my brain Steve Jobs and Bill Gates owns. But, we have acquired skills in our intimate, repeated interaction with our environment that actually are causing changes. And that is true for all of the things that we do repetitively. So it's true for using your car. There's a whole tradition of research looking at the effects of tool use on brain function. And it turns out that when you master the use of a tool, grasp it, and intend to use it, the body representation in your brain changes so that literally to your brain, your body ends at the end of the, say, screwdriver you're holding. So you could ask, what are the tools when you meditate? When you sit in a posture, many things, they come to represent a preparation for the use of a certain skill. We don't have research on this. It's really just taking research from another tradition, tool use, and body remapping, and conjecturing what are the tools in contemplative practice. One of the tools may be actually attentional. Your attention system activation may become associated in terms of increased activation with the intent to focus on your breath. You wouldn't want that to not generalize and say, oh, now I have to do my homework. I better meditate first. It would be much better if, I'll take that approach toward increased focus and attention to the next task. So I think these are avenues for further research. These studies are being led by Baljinder Sadra in consultation with Susan Barrow-Wu at Emory University.
Well, and certainly indicates that there are tangible things going on with our practice. And as you'd mentioned, there are overpopulation. There are benefits that we see moment by moment in our daily lives, and that it helps us to take those moments that we have on the cushion into the next activity we do that's not on the cushion. Because as you'd said before, there's not really a separation there. That is all a part of our living experience.
I also think that the possibility exists that depending upon the balance in your life of practice, things have the potential of getting imbalanced. We find now that people we have addiction to our portable electronic devices. The iPhone is a totem.
I have mine right here, and it's not getting more than 2 feet away from me.
Right, and I have mine, as my in my hand as well now. One could ask, are there risks associated or potentially adverse consequences to the kind of deconstruction that happens in contemplative practice? And I know that there are scientists who are interested in studying that. Willoughby Britton at Brown is formally investigating that. It's important to keep this sense of balance, and I don't know always how the ultimate goals of contemplative practice square with life in this culture at this time.
And that in itself is an ongoing area of study, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to find out more in the studies that you're doing and have you back on the podcast at some point to tell us some of the interesting things that you're finding, because this area in itself, just from this discussion and with Catherine McLean that we'd had before, is fascinating. And
we are actively going to be asking those questions and should be able to be back at you with some very interesting findings.
Can't wait. Cliff, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate your time.
Well, great. It's been a real pleasure, Ted. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for the Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on The Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.